So at this meeting, I think there were some confirmatory results presented that will help inform practice. And then I think there were a lot of interesting early phase studies that won't necessarily change things in 2026. So for instance, in the Piece 3 study, which looked at patients with, one of the most important changes is in our terminology with the Prostate Cancer Working Group 4 coming out. So in patients with androgen pathway modulator resistant disease, or APMR, that we used to call CRPC, in those patients that generally are naive to an ARPI, there's a little bit of abiraterone there, but mostly naive to an ARPI with or without prior docetaxel exposure, they entered the Piece 3 study and were randomized to the standard of care at the time of enzalutamide alone, or enzalutamide plus radium-223, the bone-targeting alpha emitter that's been approved for a number of years. And what was presented at ESMO a couple of years ago was that there was a benefit in terms of progression-free survival and what most of us considered a pretty strong overall survival result, although as designed, officially not statistically significant, partly because of some crossing of the Kaplan-Meier curves. What was presented this year was really that confirmation. So now it is officially statistically significant using a log rank test that an overall survival benefit of that drug. Not entirely shocking because each drug individually had an overall survival benefit, but the magnitude of the effect I think was quite impressive initially and remains quite impressive. And most patients, in fact, do have bone metastasis. The downside, like in many of the trials, is that I think we're making advances faster than we can do clinical trials, at least to have the final results. So most patients today are not naive to an ARPI. So whether or not a second ARPI is going to add to radium, we do not know, but there is an ongoing trial that's fully accrued that is asking the same question with docetaxel. So post-ARPI, docetaxel alone versus docetaxel plus radium. That's why the study is called DORA, docetaxel radium. Based on a randomized phase 2, there's an advantage both in terms of efficacy and safety. So the two drugs, partly because of the different dose and schedule, are both more efficacious and less toxic in the randomized phase 2. So we'll see this year or next year, I think, a readout of that particular study.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So you're talking about the enfortumab vedotin plus pembrolizumab data in bladder cancer, correct? Okay, because you said prostate cancer. So just to clarify, so we've known, not for a lot of years, but some very impressive data of an antibody drug conjugate, enfortumab vedotin, I'm just going to call it EV, with the PD-1 inhibitor pembrolizumab. We knew that it had incredibly impressive data for the first time, anything really beating a cisplatin combination in metastatic disease. Very impressive, and even though the control arm, because of advances, was not exactly the best possible, because it was such a big difference that really became the standard of care, improving overall survival, and maybe a tail of the curve. But we also know that most patients are not cured in the metastatic setting. When we are able to bring that into a combination with local therapy, we might be able to improve the cure rate. So we heard last year that in patients that are not eligible for cisplatin, the addition of EV plus pembrolizumab, both before and after cystectomy, led to a recurrence-free survival and an overall survival advantage versus surgery alone. Not surprising, good drugs, they work. This trial went head-to-head against cisplatin-based chemotherapy, so went up against actually something that really works, and they could receive postoperative adjuvant immunotherapy versus EV pembro plus postoperative. And not only was the primary endpoint of event-free survival positive, so was overall survival with a pretty impressive hazard ratio of more than a 30% improvement, about a 35% improvement in overall survival, despite getting platinum-based therapy before surgery, which was the previous standard of care, and some also got additional therapy adjuvantly or for recurrence. So I think this really cements what started to change the shift from platinum-based chemotherapy to an EV pembro-based regimen, importantly leading to more cures, not just an overall survival kind of a difference. So that I think is really practice changing from this meeting. So I would say we're in an era where there's a couple of key problems and maybe some solutions. So one is that we have many different current treatments, particularly for this APM-resistant disease state with different categories, hormonal therapy, chemotherapy, bone-targeted therapy, PARP inhibitors, molecularly selected therapy, PSMA-targeted therapy, and patients are living a lot longer. With no new advances in terms of therapy, I think that we just use them in a better place, which is often earlier, or with better patient selection, with better biomarkers. I think there can be improvements even if there's no new drugs. So moving them to a different disease state where they may be more effective and or patient selection with predictive biomarkers, I think that can make a huge difference to the field in real time. The other missing part is new drugs, new targets. So even though we have double digits in terms of the number of drugs, many of them are similar. So we have 4 ARPs in the United States, different ones in China, but they're all fairly similar. So I think I think that most prostate cancer remains AR-driven, and I think there's hope for additional AR-targeted drugs. But even though we have a dozen different drugs, we don't really have a dozen different therapies for an individual patient. So new drugs, new targets. I would say that the field, as I see it, is one major way is more potent AR targeting. Another is cell surface targeting, with whether it's a targeted radionuclide, a targeted cytotoxic, or what is of high interest, T-cell redirectors bispecifics. I think that those may be the first real immunotherapy to work in prostate cancer. So, and there's many more beyond that. So I think the future is bright for our patients, and I encourage participation in clinical trials so we can get the answers faster.